docs. Okay, I don't know. Pop, 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 and I deselected enable multi-track video to or multi-track video. So that's probably what did it. Alright, so we'll get back into it. Excellent health. But I don't see myself yet. And then also, should I be in portrait? Alright, I'm sure portrait's gonna be fine. Okay, there's the Twitch, there's the YouTube. I would love if the video itself loaded and we're ready to go. Okay, option number 2. Is that we go bop 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 bop. Man, this is crazy how much it crops. And of course I have no idea how much the oh no, it was well beyond the frame here. Okay, so now I just want to see if I'm visible on Twitch. Oh, so we're gonna have to download the app on there. Boop. Alright, let's get back into it and just hope that I am. Okay. So we're talking about confabulation. Well, talking about self-knowledge. We are talking about whether research on confabulation, and not just in the special cases, but in the more general cases, like with the Stockings experiment and with Johansson et al.'s experiment with choice blindness with the photo. They say, hey, subject, do you like photo A or photo B? And they're like, oh, I like photo A. Oh, okay, cool. Hey, here's the photo you chose. Why'd you like this one? Oh, I really liked this one because of all the ink markings. Oh, okay, that's so funny because actually you said you wanted this one. Okay, great. And we're wondering, where are we actually? We're trying to figure out, what this tells us about whether we know ourselves through self-observation or through some peculiar access to our own minds. Okay, open Twitch. I'm gonna have to find my password. Log in. No, maybe it's like with Google. Continue. Aerosol. Scan QR code. All right, we're just gonna hope on that I'm up. Okay. Oh wait, let me go back to. Okay, great. So, so page 62, Neville chooses photo A, and you are asked why he chose photo B, since photo A has been switched with photo B. Because you do not have any direct or introspective access to Neville's preference for photo A, you might fail to recognize the swap. Perhaps you will answer the question so that his choice seems sensible or reasonable. You might say, oh, he chose it because he thinks that the woman in the photo seems nicer than the other one. Or, oh, he chose it because he thinks that the woman had more personality. The experimental result can be nicely explained by the self-observation hypothesis. Neville needs to observe his own behavior when reporting why he, allegedly, chose photo B, just like you do when explaining why he allegedly chose it. Success and failure of self-knowledge. Before moving on, let us consider an issue concerning confabulation studies. It is tempting to think that cases of confabulation involve inaccurate or unsuccessful judgments about one's own mental states. Participants in the studies discussed above are bad at self-knowledge. Because of this, confabulation studies might threaten not only the idea of peculiar self-knowledge, but also the idea of privileged self-knowledge. But is this really the right interpretation of confabulation studies? Based on the evidence of pervasive confabulation concerning reasons for attitudes and choices, Krista Lawler, in 2003, argues that mental state self-attributions lack authority as they are not as accurate as third-party attributions and fail to correlate with the person's future behavior. On the basis that ill-grounded explanations of attitudes and choices are virtually indistinguishable from well-grounded ones and are common, one might argue that we should be genuinely concerned about the reliability of self-knowledge. Indeed, some interpret the standard philosophical account of confabulation as an instance of failed mind reading. Confabulation shows that people make mistakes when attributing mental states to themselves. If confabulation turns out to be a widespread phenomenon in everyday social practice, this would seriously undermine first-person authority of mental state attribution. Consider the stockings experiment once more. Imagine that participants choose the rightmost pair of stockings because of position effects. When asked to explain their choices, they answer that they chose that pair because of its qualities. As they do not mention the role of the position effect in their choice, their explanation is ill-grounded. They confabulate. Not only do they offer an ill-grounded explanation, but as a result of confabulating, they also form the belief that the pair of stockings they chose is the brightest, and that belief is false. Participants who are asked for an explanation of their choice produce an ill-grounded causal claim due to their ignorance of the mental processes underlying their choices. Whether the form of non-clinical confabulation we are examining here involves a failure of mental state self-attribution depends on what we take successful mental state self-attributions to require. In their original paper on priming effects, Nisbet and Wilson are clear that participants' verbal reports are inaccurate because participants ignore the mental processes leading to their choices and as a result misidentify the reasons for their choices. I think they mean here ignore, like, are ignorant of, not that sort of they could observe them and then are like, nah. Confabulation is evidence for the view that people are blind to the processes responsible for their choices, but this does not imply that they are also blind to the choices they made, to the actual choices. Independently of whether research participants can identify the reasons for their choices are authentic in the sense that they are sincerely reported and genuinely endorsed. If successful mental state self-attributions require awareness of one's attitudes and choices, then they are not threatened by confabulation. I'm reading that again. If successful mental state self-attributions require awareness of one's attitudes and choices, then they are not threatened by confabulation. I'm not really doing anything with that sentence. So, if successful mental state self-attributions require awareness of one's attitudes and choices. Oh, right. Okay. So if so we know that people No, 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 no. I'm not understanding the sentence. So we know um, that people confabulate. They make up a story about why they did what they did. Um, and there are many, advertising's the big one. Hey, why'd you buy that? Oh, because it's a good product. False. It's because the packaging was a nice color. Um, so confabulation is a threat potentially to I don't know. I'm moving on. I'm moving on. Seems like an important sentence, but it's not doing anything for me. Is there a way to see? Oh, I can see a chat here. Oh, nice. Oh, do I believe in God? Um, no. Short answer, no. But I'd love to have a longer conversation about it. Oh, I probably completely missed that person. Didn't even know how to turn the damn chat on. Oh, chat settings. Show viewer count, show avatars. Alright, that's good. Oh, enable in stream. No, we're not dealing with all that right now. Okay. Does successful mental state self-attribution require that people are aware of the mental processes responsible for their choices? I mean, what if you well, no, because you could infer them. This sounds like an implausibly demanding requirement. In the cases where confabulation has been observed and documented, such as consumer choice, moral judgments, and hiring decisions, causal factors leading to the choice are likely to be psychological processes that involve priming effects, socially conditioned emotional reactions, and implicit biases that cannot be directly experienced or easily observed. But rather need to be inferred on the basis of the systematic and scientific study of human behavior. Because you can have self knowledge if you fucking read some important stuff in neuroscience and psychology. Damn it, I did it again. Whatever. Does successful mental state self attribution require that people's subsequent behavior is explained and reliably predicted on the basis of that self attribution? This also sounds like an implausibly demanding requirement and one that imposes more stability, that's why it's demanding, and consistency on people's mental lives than is reasonable to expect. I don't know why I said and. This is the only reason I can think of so far. We do not know whether people who claim to have chosen a pair of stockings for its texture would choose the softest pair of stockings at their next consumer choice survey. But should they not do so, the fact that mental state self-attributions fail to shape their future behavior does not speak so much against self-knowledge as against the crystallization of preference criteria for stockings. This is even more evident in the case of choice blindness. In the case of the experiment on faces, Johansson and colleagues embrace a preference misattribution account of choice blindness, suggesting that participants are literally blind to their choices and misattribute preferences to themselves. The explanation would be that participants who failed to detect the manipulation chose photo A because they found that face most attractive, and then, when asked why they chose photo B after it was switched for photo A, they misattribute a preference to themselves and come to think that this face is most attractive. However, some have argued that preference change is the best interpretation of the experiment, meaning that participants do not misattribute preferences to themselves when they defend a choice that is different from the one they initially made, but rather change their preference in the course of the study due to the manipulation in the experiment. In this case, participants have an initial preference for photo A, which explains their choice, but when asked why they chose photo B, they form a new preference for photo B, which explains them being able to offer reasons for choosing that photo. Certainly doesn't sing, but I guess why not? Dominic McIver Lopez claims that in the manipulation condition of the experiment, participants give reasons for what has become their new choice. For Lopez, it is no surprise that preferences are changeable and amenable to manipulation. The newly ascribed preferences are real and are newly formed as a result of the participants' beliefs about the choices they made. Given that most participants do not detect the manipulation, they come to believe that they chose the face that is presented to them as their choice. Participants do not realize that their preference shifted. In the manipulation condition, reasons are often given in the past tense. I thought she had more personality in a way. I chose her because she smiled. I chose her because she had dark hair. This strongly suggests that people believe that their new preference was there all along, failing to appreciate the preference shift and the role of manipulation in determining this preference shift. The participants' belief that the choice presented to them was the one that they had made determines the preferences they ascribe to themselves when they give reasons for the choice. Perhaps subjects in the manipulation condition changed their preference as a result of their choice. Since they did not notice the manipulation, they believed that they chose the displayed face, and this fact determines their preference. On this hypothesis, subjects' reasons do not accord with their initial preference as revealed by their initial choice, but they do accord with their eventual preference as determined by what they took to be their choice. Lopez, 2014. When asked again about their preferences at a later time, participants in the manipulated condition chose the face that they provided reasons for choosing in the experiment, i.e., they provided reasons for why they chose the switched photo and not the face they had originally chosen. According to Lopez, this suggests that reasons cement preferences, meaning that when one gives reasons for a choice, the preference expressed in that choice sticks and becomes more stable. Interesting. Okay, moving on. Section 2.4, the moderate view. So far, we have seen some empirical evidence for self-observation. In some cases, including rather unusual ones, split brain patients, hypnosis, etc., and fairly mundane cases, priming effects in consumer choice, choice blindness, etc., we rely on observation in the same way that we rely on observation to come to know somebody else's mind. This means that the extreme peculiarity view is hopeless. Boom, done. We are then left with two options: the moderate view and the extreme parity view. In the former case, self-observation is at work in some contexts, such as the ones in the experiments above, but not in others. The peculiarity of self-knowledge is limited, but it is not denied. In the latter case, self-observation is always at work. What we have seen in the experiments above is just the tip of the iceberg. There is nothing peculiar about self-knowledge. Self-observation is all there is to self-knowledge. Sorry, what? Are we making that claim? How did we get that far all of a sudden? In the latter case, right, okay. In the extreme parity view, self-observation is always at work. And what we have seen in the experiments above is just the tip of the iceberg. There is nothing peculiar about self-knowledge. Self-observation is all there is to self-knowledge. All right, well, let us examine these two options in more detail. So the moderate view has been supported by many authors in philosophy and psychology. On the psychology side, for example, Bem defends the idea of self-observation, but adds that self-observation happens to the extent that internal cues are weak, ambiguous, or uninterpretable. On the philosophy side, for example, Byrne defends the idea of peculiar self-knowledge, but adds that there is certainly room for debate about the importance of third-person behavioral access to one's mental states. According to the moderate view, self-observation is at work in some contexts, but not in others. The crucial question for this view is, what are the contexts in which self-observation is at work? The answer to this question might be found when we look carefully at the contexts in which people confabulate. Confabulation experiments seem to put participants in rather peculiar contexts. For example, the stockings experiment involves a rather peculiar situation in which the participants are first asked to choose among identical stockings, and then they need to respond to the question, hey, why'd you choose this pair? This situation is unlike our everyday choice situations where, for example, we choose from different stockings on display in a supermarket and nobody asks us why immediately after the choice. Let us consider two hypotheses. Let us consider two hypotheses. The first is that self-observation happens in the context in which participants are supposed to choose among identical items. That's why self-observation is happening. The second hypothesis is that self-observation happens in the context in which participants are supposed to answer the why question. Let us begin with the first hypothesis. As Johansson and colleagues have noted, the stockings experiment involved a rather strange and contrived task in which experimenters have given the participants the artificial choice between identical stockings. Since all items are the same, perhaps participants do not have a strong preference or no preference at all, which creates a context in which internal cues are weak. And that's Bem who keeps saying that, right? Yeah. But yeah, back to the top of the page, Bem defends the idea of self-observation, but adds that self-observation happens to the extent that internal cues are weak, ambiguous, or uninterpretable. However, it is not clear that the choice blindness study can be explained by this hypothesis. After all, participants choose among different items, e.g. photo A and photo B, in the experiment. Of course, it is conceivable that participants do not have a strong preference despite their choice among different items. After all, the choice does not have any significant implications for their lives. But not all cases in which confabulation and choice blindness are observed involve something inconsequential such as trivial consumer choices or assessing the attractiveness of strangers' faces. For instance, choice blindness has been observed in cases where people were asked about their moral principles or political commitments. Oh yeah, we were reading about this in The Righteous Mind, which I haven't brought here yet. Okay. And that was really, really interesting. I hope I have a video of reading that. In this context, the failure to detect the manipulation causes greater concern than in the context of consumer choice or aesthetic judgments. It is perhaps understandable that participants' preferences about the attractiveness of strangers' faces can be easily manipulated because people may not come to make those choices with existing preferences and may not care much about the attractiveness of faces that they have never seen before. So, mm, however, preferences about moral and political issues, e.g., it is more important for a society to promote the welfare of its citizens than to protect their personal integrity, are expected to be more stable, and they may even count as self defining for those agents who see themselves as engaged in politics. Participants in the studies by Hall and colleagues were asked to complete what the authors describe as a self transforming questionnaire on either foundational moral principles, condition 1, or topical moral issues, condition 2. Oh, good. So is this going to cover it here? All right, well, I'll just find out with you, huh? Um, so this happened just before a general election in Sweden at a time when people who let me tell you what the about the hate ones or height, however you pronounce it. So what can I actually tell you about them? So there would be like, for instance, a story that's presented to a subject where an insurgent in Afghanistan killed 5 American soldiers, and then we were asked, let's say this might not be right, but they were asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how, they asked Americans on a scale of 1 to 10, how immoral is that? How bad is that this insurgent killed these 5 soldiers, American soldiers? And so the person says, "Oh, that's a 10. It's terrible." Let's say it's a conservative subject. Let's say, "Oh, that's the worst fucking thing in the world." And then you ask them why. Why is that so bad? Well, because they are murdering people who are just doing their jobs. Okay. Now you ask another conservative subject. You're gonna ask a group. You ask some other conservative subjects. Hey, suppose that the Venezuelan army uh, was here. We kidnapped their president, and so they came to rescue their president. And while they were, you know, doing their thing, some fucking New Yorker, let's say some dude from Mississippi, while they're whatever. I wanted him to be someone that the conservatives would relate to, but of course there are plenty of New Yorker conservatives. So some New Yorker killed 5 Venezuelan soldiers. What? Oh no, not what? Oh, yeah, that's not nice. I'd probably give that a 4. Oh, why is that a 4 on the scale of evil? Well, because these guys are coming in and invading our country. So I mean, it's sad that they lost their lives, but also they were a threat. So absolutely, if you have like foreign soldiers in your country that like you didn't ask for, um, they're people with guns. They can, they can do something. Anything can go wrong, and they're still human beings. So of course the power can go to their head and so on. So yeah, I give that about a 4, and there's my reason. Like that's basically how the experiments that Height talked about went. Okay, but now we're talking about Johansson's, I think, experiments. So this happened just before a general election in Sweden at a time when people who were hold on. Bop, 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 bop. At a time when people who were usually not interested in politics were likely to think about these kinds of issues in their daily lives. Participants had to rate their agreement with a statement using a 9-point scale, and then explain their ratings to the experimenter. The transforming part of the experiment was that 2 of the statements read out by the experimenter were actually the opposite of the statements originally rated. Okay, so different experiment. The ratings given were kept the same, but the statement was reversed. So participants were in effect presented with the opposite of the opinion they expressed earlier. The experiment was designed to see whether participants would be led to endorse a view that was in opposition to the one they had just stated. Once the participant had read the reverse statement, an experimenter would summarize their view back to them with a question such as, "So you don't agree that statement?" or "So you do agree that statement?" This mechanism was in place to ensure participants were sure of what they were committing themselves to. The manipulated trials were understood as corrected when participants noticed something strange immediately, spontaneous detection, or claimed that something was amiss only later at the time of debriefing, retrospective correction. Whereas trials were understood as accepted when the participant showed no sign of having noticed that the reversal of the opinion they originally expressed was being fed back to them. In the first condition, in which the questionnaire was on foundational moral principles, around 33% of the trials were spontaneously detected, and a further 8% were retrospectively detected after the experiment. Okay, so less than 50% were corrected. The other ones, more than half, were accepted. And I think it's important. And you know what? Let's not even look at it as half. Let's look at it as a third, because there are a lot of cases in real life where, so I don't know how or why or what the conditions were for their retrospective detection, but I'm skeptical about those conditions existing in everyday situations. So I'm tempted to say that only a third were corrected / detected, whatever. In condition 2, nearly 50% of the manipulations were spontaneously detected, but very few participants claimed to detect the manipulations retrospectively. Condition 1 was like moral, and condition 2 is political. No, condition 1 is foundational moral principles, and then condition 2 is topical moral principles. So, I guess let's say half for both, just to keep it simple. Framed for individuals, 69% of participants accepted at least one of the two reverse statements. Okay. So, yeah, maybe it was 50% this time, 69% accepted at least one. The manipulation was performed very subtly. So even participants who noticed something strange did not detect the manipulation as such, although they did declare that they must have previously misread or misunderstood the statement. There was no correlation between self-evaluation of strength of moral conviction and correction. So those participants who believed themselves to hold strong moral opinions in general were no more likely to correct the manipulations. Although there was a positive relationship between level of agreement and spontaneous detection. A full third, 31.3%, a full third of all, it's not really full, but anyway, a full third of all manipulated trials rated at the endpoints of the scale. Oh, a full third of all manipulated trials that were rated at the endpoints of the scale, so 1 or 9, remained undetected, which shows that not even extreme levels of agreement or disagreement with statements guarantees detection. However, those participants who claimed to be politically active were more likely to spontaneously detect the manipulation in condition 2 when compared to politically active participants in condition 1. From this, what do we learn? I'm too busy thinking about Twitch and whether there's a Twitch chat and whether I'm missing it. From this, we learn that those who identified as politically active were less likely to be manipulated into misidentifying, oh, they're like topical ones. Oh, right, because if they're active about a topical moral issue. Got you. So from this, we learn that those who identified as politically active were less likely to be manipulated into misidentifying their attitudes, or were less likely to have their attitudes changed. Did you establish that in both conditions, those who were politically active were less likely or were more likely to detect? Huh. I don't know if you did that. I thought you just, because I thought that's what you were doing, but however, those participants who claimed to be politically active were more likely to spontaneously detect the manipulation in condition 2 when compared to politically active participants in condition 1. Yeah, in condition 2 is what you told us, but in condition 2, were less likely to have their attitude shaped. It would be interesting to examine whether there are any other individual differences that can explain the correction acceptance rates among participants. Let us now consider the second hypothesis, that self-observation happens in the context in which participants are supposed to answer the why question. So previously, we were just talking about the first hypothesis, that self-observation happens in the context in which the options are identical. Is that right? Yeah. So now, the context when they're asked why right after they make their choice. All right, well, Nisbet and Wilson said the following in the opening of their classic article. Why do you like him? How did you solve this problem? Why did you take that job? In our daily life, we answer many such questions about the cognitive processes underlying our choices, evaluations, judgments, and behavior. Nisbet and Wilson are certainly right. We face many why questions in daily life. But there are some reasons to think that why questions, unlike what questions, such as what do you think or what do you want, create the context in which self-observation is likely. All right, well, my hypothesis, what I tell people anyway, is that I don't think that we, brains, keep track, keep a history, a record, a log of the underlying of the processes that lead to things. So, some things get saved in a memory, some things get experienced, but there certainly isn't a complete record. Also, even if there were a record, it's possible that it's just like more efficient energetically for energy. It's more efficient to just think, well, why would I do that rather than why did I do that? Okay, so let's see what he says. So just gonna note for when I discuss with Dr. Schachtman. So no log, and consulting log. Both of these would be costly. Well, more costly. More costly than why would I? Okay, so perhaps why questions create the context in which internal cues are weak, ambiguous, or uninterpretable, as we keep hearing that Bem has talked about. For example, a why question might be taken as asking the cause of the decision rather than the decision itself. Participants do not have strong internal cues about the cause of their decision, and thus they have no choice but to appeal to self-interpretation. Nisbet and Wilson propose a distinction between content and process. Well, get out of here. I mean, you could call it like a spectrum. It's like, you know, huh. Okay. I'm curious about this definitely, but I'm also thinking that you could definitely describe I'm also thinking that you could describe items in the process as content, but then content is just the more significant things or the things that are used by more of the other processes. Whereas what he's referring to processes, once those processes lead to the content, those processes like play no other role, but that content is going to go and play other roles. That doesn't sing for me. That doesn't sound right. I don't know why, how that, I can't picture that, like, that there are some cells that, nah, I don't know. I don't like it. We'll see. Okay, so, so okay, so Nisbet and Wilson propose a distinction between content, i.e., what occupies one's consciousness at that time, and process, i.e., the causal origin of content. I mean, this is just more dichotomizing this conscious stuff and this unconscious, and I think it's much more of a spectrum. Um, but see also Wilson 2002. Sounds like maybe Wilson disagreed with what Nisbet and he came up with. I don't know. We confabulate about the latter, but not about the former. We confabulate about the processes, but not about the content because, well, that's available. In fact, Nisbet and Wilson accept that we do indeed have direct access to a great storehouse of private knowledge of the content of consciousness, and the content belongs to private facts that can be known with near certainty. Not feeling it. Alternatively, the why question might be taken as asking participants to justify their oh, this is separate from what we've been saying. So perhaps, it says here, perhaps why questions create the context in which internal cues are weak, so they have no choice. We have no choice but to confabulate. Alternatively, the why question might be taken as asking participants to justify their decision, in which case it has to be something that you think the other person will buy. The why question creates the context in which participants are supposed to justify their decision rather than simply report their psychological states and processes. Under the psychological pressure to justify their decision, participants appeal to self-observation, which enables them to explain their own behavior in terms of beliefs and desires that make their behavior reasonable or justifiable. For example, a participant, Jeremiah, chooses, perhaps, alternatively, for example, the participant, Jeremiah, chooses pair D because of the position effect. He interprets the experimenter's question about his choice as a request for a justification. This is a difficult request. There's no good reason for Jeremiah's choice, as the stockings to choose from were identical, unless we believe that we are in a situation in which the position of an item is a good reason to choose it. Under the psychological pressure to justify his choice, Jeremiah says that pair D has the best texture, which latches on to generally plausible reasons for choosing stockings and other similar items. We are so desperate to believe that we are reasonable. And because I see this, whenever I tell people about experiments that I think show that we're not reasonable, they're always like, oh, but no, maybe the person just blah, 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 blah. And I know I shouldn't be so dismissive, like, you know, especially just the way I presented it. But I am. Because here's the thing. This is what I call a NACO, okay? A natural compulsion. So whenever people, like, try to defend believing in a God, or, yeah, let's just use that example, believing in a God. Well, we know that religion's a NACO. We know that brains are eager to be religious, and, you know, it's typically, I mean, like, even me, right? Someone asked me today at Walmart if I was spiritual. The cashier did. I have the same mechanisms as you, bro. Well, you know, not all, but I feel God's presence. I feel the presence of a higher power. The narrative sings for me. It's like, sure, yeah. Then a being was like, here, there's the earth. So I experience myself the natural compulsion toward religious belief. So when people like keep coming up with, oh, but maybe blah blah blah, maybe blah 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 blah. It just sounds like they're just trying really hard because they're motivated because they have this compulsion, this natural compulsion. So whenever I think that a certain belief is a NACO, I kind of quickly become dismissive of any justification for that NACO that involves like, oh, but what if, or oh, but maybe this is the case. Which then there's probably a term for that that's not coming to mind for those kinds of defenses, justifications. Okay. Um, okay, great. Um, Note that this is not to say that Jeremiah's answer is plausible or unproblematic. Even as a justification for his particular choice of the rightmost pair of stockings within a set of 4 identical pairs of stockings, his answer is still problematic. A justification is not supposed to disclose the causal processes that led to his choice, but rather to highlight what good reasons there are for that choice, regardless of whether those reasons did motivate him to make the choice. The problem is that the reason he provided to justify his choice does not match the features of the situation because all the pairs of stockings were the same. Are you going to make some concluding remarks about the moderate view here? No, of course not, because we have to first see the other extreme. So we've seen the extreme peculiar, and you can see that on my YouTube if you are watching on Twitch, and I wasn't streaming that on Twitch. So the extreme parity view, section 2.5. Oh, but I should tell you what it is. The extreme peculiarity view is that all of our self-knowledge comes via some special and distinct method, whatever it may be, experience, whatever that means, period. Yeah, just to find it, right? What did I just say? What I want to say is that the extreme peculiarity view is that all of our self-knowledge, yeah, comes from like us just sort of automatically, directly, or something knowing ourselves. Whereas the extreme parity view is that the way that we know ourselves is the exact same way, although we have maybe some different information, because remember Carruthers talked about inner speech, which obviously, but anyway, is that your self-knowledge, you get your self-knowledge from the exact same way as you get knowledge about other people. Okay, so the extreme parity view, extreme parity and parsimony. Now let us turn to the extreme parity view. According to this view, self-knowledge is always, or self-observation is always at work. By observation, because that wasn't really clear to me, we don't just mean looking, it's more inferential. We don't just mean experiencing, it's more interpreting. Self-observation is all there is to self-knowledge. Sean Nichols and Stephen Stitch summarize the view. The extreme parity view proposes to maintain the parallel between detecting one's own mental states and detecting another person's mental states quite strictly. The only information used as evidence for the inference involved in detecting one's own mental state is the information provided by perception, in this case, perception of oneself, and by one's background beliefs, in this case, background beliefs about one's own environment and previously acquired beliefs about one's own mental states. Note that we do not have direct evidence for the extreme parity view. We only have the evidence for self-interpretation in some limited contexts, such as abnormal cases, e.g. split brain cases, and experimental contexts, e.g. the Stockings experiment. The extreme parity view is counterintuitive. For example, it does not explain those occasions in which we deliberate. The extreme parity view gets something right. People read their own minds, self-observe, and self-interpret much more frequently than they realize. But by being extreme, the view misses some important nuances. People sometimes deliberate, rarely and not very rationally, and it is overwhelmingly implausible to think otherwise. Let me reread that. People sometimes deliberate, rarely and not very rationally, and it is overwhelmingly implausible to think otherwise, that people deliberate. When making a decision that will have wide-ranging and long-term implications, e.g., which subject to study at university or whether to move to a foreign country, people consider the advantages and disadvantages of each outcome, ask for advice, and generally make up their own mind without the need to self-observe. Are you claiming this? I don't know. I'm putting a yod by that. I don't agree with that, bro. Um, do I want to well, no words are really coming to mind. I don't think I want to dig right now. That'll be another one to discuss with as no, no, because I want to save that for the like 3 or 4 things throughout the book. So we only done one so far. Okay. Despite the lack of direct evidence for it, and despite its being counterintuitive, the extreme parity view can be defended by an indirect argument. We call this the parsimony argument for the extreme parity. The extreme parity view gives us a parsimonious explanation of the available data. Sorry, what does parsimonious mean again? You know how many times I've looked this word up? Frugal. More definitions, please. I just never understand how it's used kind of metaphorically or not literally or something. But hopefully it'll make sense to us. Of this frugal argument. All right, so the extreme parity view gives us a frugal explanation of the available data. The extreme parity view explains all cases of self-knowledge in a simple and unified manner in terms of self-observation. We do not need to posit, oh, I see, okay. We don't need to posit additional peculiar methods for gaining self-knowledge. It's kind of an Occam's razor type shit, right? As Carruthers has noted, in order to warrant the extra complexity, it needs to be shown that the extreme parity view on its own is inadequate, or else some positive evidence of an additional method should be provided. Parsimony arguments are often used in philosophy and in science. I use them all the time, so I hate that I keep forgetting this word. If we have 2 theories, theory A and theory B, which are equally good at explaining the available data, and if A is more complicated than B, then we ought to choose B since it is more parsimonious. So if we have 2 hypotheses about self-knowledge, the moderate view and the extreme parity view, which are equally good at explaining the available data, and if the moderate view is more complicated than the extreme parity view, then we ought to choose the extreme parity view since it is more parsimonious. So, great. So when I tell you that we are brains and you go, oh, maybe there's like a soul that's like communicating with the brain and then the brain's producing the behavior, I'm like, parsimony, bro. The parsimony argument, premise 1, the moderate view and the extreme parity view are equally good at explaining the available data. Premise 2, the moderate view is more complicated than the extreme parity view. Premise 3, if the moderate view and the extreme parity view are equally good at explaining the available data, and if the former is more complicated than the latter, then we ought to choose the extreme parity view. Conclusion, we ought to choose the extreme parity view. Hey, I accept it because the great thing about a parsimony argument is that it's not conclusive. It's not, it's not permanent. It's not forever. It's just like, look, that other complicated explanation could be right, but we don't have any evidence for that yet. So let's just go with the simpler one that does an equally good job of explaining things and, isn't doesn't require more evidence as yours does with all those other elements. Should we accept the parsimony argument in this case? Is the extreme parity view really defendable? Our focus will be on premise one, namely that the moderate view and the extreme parity view are equally good at explaining the available data. Can this premise be challenged? Challenging premise one involves, challenging premise one involves providing some cases that the extreme parity view cannot explain, but that the moderate view can. Are there such cases? All right, like 5 or 6 more pages, and then we will have read chapter 2, self-knowledge. And we're making great progress. This is the best way to get ready for this interview, bro. And of course, that will be available in the Sassy playlist. I'm doing it. I have 2 interviews. One with the author of this book, and she's the one who encouraged me to read this book. Oh, I can put it here. So The Self, a very short introduction. Now, Dr. Schachtman does not agree with me or Jay Garfield, which is my other interview. This one's going to be via Zoom because he's retired to Tasmania. So, by the way, how do I know about this book? And this book is amazing, bro. I've only gotten through, I've been listening to it. This just came in today. I think I've gotten through chapter 1. So the preface in chapter 1. And thrilled. Those are both going to be on January 28th. So should be published on January 29th. My 35th birthday. Great. Let's keep it moving. Okay, so it's until page 76. So page 75. 76 is further resources, but let's not forget to read the questions. Okay, so the interpretive sensory access theory. Nichols and Stitch point out that it seems obvious that people can sit quietly without exhibiting any relevant behavior and report on their current thoughts. Yeah, but Carruthers included, never mind, they're going to get to that. For example, it is possible that a person, Joan, knows that she believes that there is an apple on the table, or that she wants to eat an apple while sitting still in the living room. This case seems to pose a serious problem for the extreme parity view, but not for the moderate view, which allows for the possibility of peculiar and non-observational access. Being unable to explain such an obvious fact, Nichols and Stitch say that the extreme parity view is crazy and it's hard to take seriously. Carruthers notes that the case can be explained by a sophisticated version of the extreme parity view. Whoa, why are you zooming in like that, bro? Why are you... Oh, no, I didn't mean to do that. Resume. God damn it. And to click this. Console. Okay. Great. Don't need that. Great. So Carruthers notes that the case can be explained by a sophisticated version of the extreme parity view, where materials for self-interpretation go beyond the observation of bodily behavior. According to Carruthers, 2009, interpretive sensory access, ISA theory, according to Carruthers' interpretive sensory access, ISA, theory, the materials for self-interpretation include both external cues, including own behavior and environment, and inner sensory cues, including inner speech and mental imagery. Yeah. There are some people that have neither, though, Carruthers, and because I would have agreed with you. I absolutely thought that, but then, we learned about all these people that have no inner monologue or inner visuals, and they still say that they experience thinking. It just doesn't have, it's like it isn't manifest, or it doesn't have, like, well, anything that sort of we see out here, so we can, explain it. It's just like a mental event. And also they still have like emotions and like feelings and associations and concepts and stuff. Okay, so the ISA theory can deal with the case of immobile Joan. Although there is no informative external cue in the case, Joan can access her internal sensory cues, including inner speech and mental imagery, that help her to learn about her beliefs, desires, and so on. Joan can attribute to herself the belief that there is an apple on the table on the basis of her inner speech sentence, an apple is on the table, or mental imagery of an apple on the table. There is a sense in which the ISA theory is not that extreme. After all, the theory permits peculiar and non-interpretive access to internal cues. I wish you had said this sooner, bro, because I was so confused early. I was like, but isn't that peculiar? Hold on. Hopefully I, underline when Carruthers. We have Kassam, Wilson. Yeah, okay. Oh, I didn't make any notes there. Okay. But anyway, you were there. Okay, so all right, here we go. So this is important. Blue, dark blue. So he's saying, Carruthers calls his view the extreme parity view, but MIYAZONO is more than happy to say, oh yeah, but he includes peculiar in his extreme parity, even though of course there should be no peculiar. What am I trying to do right now? To inner speech and mental imagery. Okay. All right. So there is a sense in which the ISA theory is not that extreme. After all, the theory permits peculiar and non-interpretive access to internal cues, such as inner speech and mental imagery. That said, the ISA theory is extreme in that it denies any peculiar access to propositional attitudes, such as beliefs or desires. According to the ISA theory, metacognitive access to propositional attitudes is always self-interpretive, where self-interpretation is based not only on external cues, but also on internal sensory cues. And also, it kills me that we're using the word sensory. I don't know, that sounds crazy to me. Because I don't think experience, like of a thought, that's not, it's not how I think of the word sensory. Mental imagery, sure, absolutely. That's occipital activity, that's vision. It's definitely a sense. It's even one of the main 5 that we learn. Note that although the ISA theory recognizes the peculiar access to internal, god damn it, I have to turn off these gestures and then, all right. Yeah, because I've got the Zoom thing on. All right, this isn't gonna happen again. Don't you worry. Boom, done. Oh, interesting. I can set what I want the zoom to be. So let's say I want the zoom to be 1. And then I can go to this. And then what if I go to this? Is it going to bring it back to 1.3? Oh, it's not. Okay, so no, we're turning that off. Okay, great. Continuing. Okay, so note that although the ISA theory recognizes the peculiar access to internal sensory cues, it is still more parsimonious than the moderate view. Any sensible account of metacognition, including the moderate view, would recognize the peculiar access to inner speech, mental imagery, and so on. Thus, the ISA theory, which recognizes the peculiar access to internal sensory cues, but does not recognize the peculiar access to propositional attitudes, is more parsimonious than the moderate view, which recognizes peculiar access to propositional attitudes, in addition to peculiar access to internal sensory cues. This means that the parsimony argument is still applicable. There are, however, some worries about the ISA theory. It requires at least 2 theoretical assumptions: a psychological assumption and a metaphysical assumption, or I guess you could say a philosophical assumption, right? Because before you were metaphysics, philosophy. The psychological assumption is that internal sensory cues regularly accompany propositional attitudes. For example, the inner speech sentence, "An apple is on the table," regularly accompanies the inner speech sentence, regularly accompanies the belief that an apple is on the table. Otherwise, i.e., if there is no such a regularity, so if there's no such regularity, the theory fails to explain the case of immobile Joan. If Joan's belief that an apple is on the table is not regularly accompanied by the inner speech sentence, "An apple is on the table," or other internal sensory cues, then she is not able to identify her belief. And I think that that might be okay. I was talking earlier about identifying her belief can be separate from having her belief, right? So she may know that an apple is on the table without identifying that she knows that an apple is on the table. And I guess you would have to ask somebody who doesn't have inner speech. I don't know. If Joan's belief that an apple is on the table is not regularly accompanied by the inner speech sentence, "An apple is on the table," or other internal sensory cues, then she is not able to identify her belief. So what does that mean? The metaphysical assumption is that internal sensory cues do not constitute propositional attitudes. For example, the inner speech sentence, an apple's on the table, does not constitute the belief that an apple is on the table, although the former reliably accompanies the latter. Otherwise, i.e., the inner speech sentence does constitute the belief. Admitting peculiar access to the inner speech sentence amounts to admitting peculiar access to the belief, which contradicts the ISA theory's denial of peculiar access to propositional attitudes. Hold on. So the metaphysical assumption is that internal sensory cues do not constitute propositional attitudes. That's what I was saying, right? Because otherwise, like if the inner speech sentence does constitute the belief, then of course if you have peculiar access to the inner speech sentence, you have peculiar access to the belief. And ISA theory says you don't have peculiar access to the belief, you just figure out the belief because you have peculiar access to the inner speech sentence. Or is this what I was saying, or is this the opposite? Hold on. The metaphysical assumption. So we're talking about two assumptions. Let me frame this again. So we're talking about two assumptions, two theoretical assumptions that the ISA theory requires. So the ISA theory requires that internal sensory cues are not the same thing as propositional attitudes, because the ISA theory says we have peculiar access to internal sensory cues. We do not have peculiar access to propositional attitudes. We infer them from the internal sensory cues. Gosh, I haven't eaten all day. And what was I saying? I was saying that that Joan, let's say she doesn't have inner speech. Then she but she still has peculiar access to like certain concepts and associations, even if they're not verbalized internally. Okay, we're gonna come back to this. Okay, so one might, so yeah, all right, we're gonna read it one more time and then we're moving on. So there are, however, some worries about the ISA theory. It requires at least two theoretical assumptions, a psychological assumption and a metaphysical assumption. The psychological assumption is that internal sensory cues regularly accompany propositional attitudes, which is not a fair assumption. There are plenty of people that don't have that. So anyway, as an example, the inner speech sentence, an apple is on the table, regularly accompanies the belief that an apple is on the table for people with inner speech. Okay. Because otherwise, if those things don't always go hand in hand, then the theory fails to explain the case of immobile Joan, because the theory requires that she have access to this inner speech, that she not need to say it out loud. But if she doesn't have inner speech, then we're in trouble. I don't think we are in trouble, bro. Yeah, as I keep saying, I think it might be okay, because even though me, the author, most people kind of think of their thinking as like inner speech and mental imagery, there are tons of people that have neither and still say that they experience thinking. So, all right, now the metaphysical assumption is that internal sensory cues do not constitute propositional attitudes. Right. No, right, yes. All clear. Very good. And because I was just about to repeat what I've said 3 times. But it's funny because before, it's funny, interesting. It's kind of the same inner speech. I mean, it's outer, but I was kind of, I mean, I wasn't saying it in my head, but it was like saying in my head, like, there was like just a slight delay between the time I was saying it and, like, I was kind of saying it in my head and it was coming out. Um, I forgot I just completely lost my train of thought. Completely lost it. Okay, so that's one problem with starting the workday much later than waking at. I am okay, great. One might worry about the compatibility of the psychological and metaphysical assumptions. If internal sensory cues regularly accompany propositional attitudes, then one might think that there must be an explanation of the regular co-occurrence of sensory cues and propositional attitudes. A simple explanation of the regular co-occurrence is that internal sensory. Sorry, I'm remembering what I was saying. I was talking about my inner speech and my. Oh yeah, I had a. Oh, so it's still a sensory thing. I had a feeling of understanding the last time, which, by the way, might not have been a feeling of understanding. It might have just been a feeling of familiarity, which we brains often conflate with understanding. That feeling of but so okay, so never mind. I'm not going to make the point that I was about to make, whatever it was. Okay, gotcha. One might worry about the compatibility of the psychological and metaphysical assumptions. If internal sensory cues regularly accompany propositional attitudes, then one might think that there must be an explanation of the regular co-occurrence of sensory cues and propositional attitudes. A simple explanation of the regular co-occurrence is that internal sensory cues are constitutive of propositional attitudes. Setting this worry aside, another problem is that the ISA theory. I mean, but no, though. Setting this worry aside, another problem is that the ISA theory might fail to explain the case of immobile Joan after all, because her internal cues are not informative enough for her to identify her propositional attitudes. Even though Joan has access to her internal sensory cues, such as the inner speech sentence, an apple is on the table, or the mental image of an apple on the table, these sensory cues are not sufficient for her to identify her belief that there is an apple on the table. Why not? For example, having the mental image of an X in your mind does not specify whether you are thinking about X or Y when you cannot discriminate X from Y in your visual imagination. Okay, right. So how does that relate to what you just said? Because she could just be thinking about an apple on a table, about a universe where there's an apple on the table. I don't get it. Suppose. Oh, almost done. Almost, depending on how quickly I understand it, how much I want to yap. Suppose that Joan recognizes a mental image of a geometrical shape with lots of angles. Suppose that she also has two hypotheses. That she is believing something about a chiliagon, i.e., a polygon with 1,000 sides, and that she is believing something about a myriagon, i.e., a polygon with 10,000 sides. Can she tell which one is correct? This is really difficult because distinguishing chiliagons from myriagons in one's visual imagination is extremely difficult. I wouldn't be able to do it. It would just be a circle, both of them. Or I would just, no, I would just kind of alternate between being like an like a decagon and a circle. Like when I'm like need to remind myself it's not a circle, I like, oh yeah, but the length of the line I'm seeing, the edge I'm seeing, no way there could be 1,000 of those lengths. So, um, As Descartes notes, the thing that I visually imagine when thinking about a Kiliagan differs in no way from the representation I should form if I were thinking of a Myriagan or any figure with very many sides. One might think, however, that this problem can be solved by inner speech. For example, Joan can conclude that she is believing something about a Kiliagan when she recognizes the inner speech word Kiliagan, or that she's believing something about a Myriagan because she recognizes the inner speech word Myriagan. But inner speech has its own problems too. Having an inner speech sentence P in your mind does not specify whether you are believing that P, desiring that P, imagining that P, supposing that P, and so on. For example, what is Joan supposed to know about her propositional attitudes when she recognizes the inner speech sentence, Caesar died in his bed? Does she believe that Caesar died in his bed? Or does she imagine that Caesar died in his bed? As Hume points out, sensory cues, this all sings to me. I agree. I mean, I don't agree it sings, but I don't remember my symbol for sing, so putting my symbol for agree. As Hume points out, sensory cues, or ideas, are the same between somebody imagining that Caesar died in his bed and somebody believing that Caesar died in his bed. The believer forms all the same ideas as the imaginer does, and the believer can't conceive any idea that the imaginer can't conceive or conjoin any ideas that the imaginer can't conjoin. To sum up, it is not clear that the ISA theory can successfully explain the case of immobile Joan. Internal sensory cues might not be informative for knowing about one's propositional attitudes. Alright, no, I'll talk after. Summary 2.6. Hold on, what am I going to talk about again? Okay, section 2.6, summary. Empirical data, especially those concerning confabulation, suggest that agents rely on self-observation to identify their own mental states, at least in some cases. This is consistent with what we call the moderate view, according to which humans know their own minds by self-observation in some cases, but not always. Next, the view that our self-knowledge always relies on self-observation and self-interpretation, what we called the extreme parity view, is certainly attractive because of its simplicity, but it faces the difficult challenge of explaining the case of immobile Joan. It is also not clear that the ISA theory can meet this challenge. Finally, according to the moderate view, our no way. Oh, because it's just the summary. So whoever my third viewer was like, oh, all right, well, gotcha. I think I am gonna pay for viewers, to be honest, because I know how the mind works and social proof. When you come into a video where you see that you're the only person, or where you even see that there's 4 or 5 people, you're like, oh, this video is not good. I wonder how much it costs. I'm curious now. All right. According to the moderate view, our self-knowledge, relies on self-observation and self-interpretation in some cases. This suggests that there are parts or domains of the mind to which people do have peculiar and direct access, and parts or domains to which people do not have peculiar and direct access. The best thing to do, if one wants to know about the parts or domains of the latter kind, is to observe and interpret one's own behavior or learn from third-person testimony. This picture is compatible with the idea that the mind is fragmented, which will be discussed in Chapter 3. So, great further resources and finishing up with questions. Questions. Do you know yourself? Wow, this is perfect. This is gonna segue perfectly, and then I'm gonna go grab some whiskey, and we're gonna chat. Me and well, I know one of my viewers is my other phone. I'd guess the other viewers like Sarah, my mother. But you know, announce yourself if you're not, or you're probably gonna leave. Oh, the only people who watch this are Sarah or his mother. Yeah, but like we're just kind of getting started. I've uploaded over 1,000 videos, but we're just getting started with the live stream. Okay. Questions. 1. Do you know yourself better than your family members or friends do? 2. If you have any special access to information about yourself, does this apply only to the content of your feelings and thoughts, or does it extend to your character traits too? 3. In what way, if any, does the literature on confabulation undermine self-knowledge claims? Is this a textbook? I'm just now realizing this might be a textbook. 4. In what context does it make more sense to hypothesize a type of self-knowledge that is not limited to self-observation and interpretation? All right, great job. Chapter 3, we're going to do tomorrow. Duality. Very exciting. I hope Father watches. Speaking of Father. So I'm so glad that I'm reading a philosophy book for the first time in... Have I ever read a philosophy book? I don't think so, actually. I don't know if I have, actually. Well, so I'm so glad I'm reading a philosophy book for the first time. Excuse me. Because you know, these are big and hard questions, and we don't have definitive answers, which makes it kind of crazy that someone's dad, someone in this room, I don't know who, but his dad, like, tells him that he's wrong. Now, of course, like, what? Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't there be curiosity? Because we don't really know who's wrong. Now, why am I not curious about his thing? Or, you know, not as curious anyway as I want him to be about mine? Because his thing is the standard thing. I feel very, very familiar, and I'd be happy for him to test me on that. I feel very familiar with the idea, the search for a metaphysical something extra. Okay? I believed in consciousness, in a conscious agent. I literally gave a presentation at a conference with a model of the mind that involved a self, a conscious, rational self, in 2015. And then my thinking evolves from there as I realized, well, stuff. So what did I realize? For instance, so I thought that the mind was this like conscious, rational self, and then a whole bunch of intuitive mechanisms, right? Including your biases, all your heuristics, your gut, all those shortcut processes, and so on. So the system 1 processes, and then you had this system 2 singular, rational, slower self. So I'm trying to think of good evidence for why I switched, why I stopped thinking that. Like, really, the most salient reason, and this is not, I guess, good direct evidence, the most salient reason is that I couldn't figure out how you could possibly tell the difference between when it's the conscious, rational self and when it's the gut. Especially since people tend to think that it's always the conscious self, like running, deciding, judging, etc. So I started to think, wait, maybe both System 1 and System 2 processes, they're all processes, automatic processes, and this consciousness thing is just kind of a story told afterwards. And then I found that there were a bunch of other people, well, years later actually, I found that there were a bunch of other people. It's a whole school of thought called illusionism. Um, and I guess, no, I guess there isn't, I guess there isn't, I guess it isn't, maybe it isn't about evidence. Because I guess the burden isn't really on me, is it? I think that the mind is a bunch of automatic modules, processes, countless, okay? Like hundreds and hundreds of billions, a trillion processes, because you can define them in different ways. You can define a process, and then you can look at the processes that constitute it. Well, we know that the brain is composed of 86 billion neurons. We're looking in there. We see all these tons of automatic pieces interacting and producing behavior and experience and so on, or experiencing their own activity, however you want to phrase it, because really it's up to you, because we don't really know how to phrase it yet or what any of it means. You're the one talking about, oh no, but there's this conscious decider and all that. Okay, show me. I know that that's the story that you have. I know that that's what you think your experience is. But I'm looking. I'm looking. Where's it at? And then you're gonna fucking talk to me about quantum mechanics to explain it? What? You don't feel yourself reaching? That doesn't hurt. You're gonna pull something. So, yeah. Now, let's talk about this self-knowledge thing regarding, again, I'm not saying it's anyone's father in particular. I realized today something that I feel so dumb for not having realized a long time ago. My dad has anxiety. Like, it's that simple. I knew he gets anxious. I knew you can tell, you can look at him, he gets very, very stressed very quickly. But I hadn't realized how kind of complete of an explanation his anxiety is. I think it's also what makes it very difficult for him to know himself, because he has certain ideas of what a man should be, and those ideas are pretty narrow. He's not like a macho or whatever, but a bit, but he's an Englishman, you understand? So that's what a man's supposed to be. Proper, follow the rules, be interested in science and philosophy, and be able to do the things that he wants to do. Be able to discuss things, think through things, and he has hated himself his whole life for not being that person, for not being able to, I want to do a project. Now I'm going to set my mind to it and do it. And he hates all the people around him for not being that thing, for not being able to discuss civilly. Well, of course, he's the least civil discusser. But it's all because of anxiety. He's an uncivil discusser because he has to work harder to protect himself from cognitive dissonance. Also, he has, so like what I mean by that is, so he has an idea. Someone else presents another idea. Panic. No, that is wrong. That is wrong. because he has stability, just like everybody does, in his idea. But some people, or like most people, feel a little bit safer than he does. And so they can handle the cognitive dissonance a little longer than he can. I don't have a point. I guess I'm just hitting you with some thoughts that I had today that felt relevant to this chapter on self-knowledge, this thing about family members, the philosophical discussion, etc. Now I was going to go get some whiskey. But you know what I'm thinking, and this might be crazy. I'm thinking about continuing, especially because I don't know who this mystery third viewer is, and it's exciting me. It's making me think that I might be doing something worthwhile. And then watch, surprise, comment, hi, it's Father. Well, thank you, Father. I love it. Thank you, Father. Hope that was okay what I said. I hope you, at any time when you feel safe. Oh, and that's another thing, though, about self-knowledge. He doesn't know that he has an anxiety problem. He literally thinks all of his big reactions are justified. And he hates when other people have big reactions. If I have a big reaction, what the fuck? Mine aren't justified. His are justified. And you can't even really get your foot in the door because, you know, if you, like, even as I was thinking today, if you say, you know, you talk about the anxiety, say, hey, you know, let's talk when you're feeling safe. Need to, what are you talking about? I don't need to feel safe. And he'll get angry because he's anxious about his status, about how he's perceived. And by talking about feeling safe, for him, that's a threat to his status, to his ability to be a conscious, in control, master of self Englishman. So, what time is it? Because, oh, it's midnight, so I might not even be able to fall asleep until like 3 or 4. But no way, no. My medicine's worn off. It would take me 45 minutes a page, and I would just be talking about my dad the whole damn time. Oh gosh, I'm getting a little bit chubby just skimming this. We're talking about system 1, system 2. We're talking about the rationality paradox. I don't really actually know what that is, but I won't be surprised if it's the same as something I call by another name. Get the fuck out. Okay, the rationality paradox is stupid. And it reminds me, and then we're just going to finish. It reminds me of someone said to me, a guy I was trying to work with on a taxonomy of biases, couldn't work with him anymore. Because I made a whole presentation for him, did a Zoom call, tried to get him to consider that thinking was much more automatic, less centralized, and less rational than he thought. And I think the last straw for me was when he said that the evidence that we are rational is that we've noticed our irrationality. I didn't say we were fucking rocks. I didn't say we were completely useless at at knowing things, or at drawing connections. Well, yeah, I wouldn't be doing what I've been doing for the last. This is like my 3rd stream. This one's been an hour and a half. The last one was like 2.5 hours. Yeah, I wouldn't be doing this if I thought that our thoughts were just completely useless. So, but it's not impressive that it has taken us, I don't know, since the Greeks to come up to identify a few hundred cognitive errors. And that's like hundreds of thousands of people contributing to that. Are very bright people. I don't think that says much for, any one of those minds. Those really great minds, just each contributing a piece, noticing. And a lot of times we probably notice biases because we disagreed with what the person was arguing. And so we were like, it's easy to find the error there. It's not like we're out here noticing the errors in our own thinking. Hey, what was that I just thought? That was weird. What shall I call that? Cognitive error. I'll call it the halo effect. That's basically never happened. And if it has happened, that person was extraordinary, bro. Okay, wait. Actually, I shouldn't say that because I think I have maybe done that. I don't know. Actually, no examples are coming to mind. There was an example that sort of felt like it was coming to mind, but there was no inner speech, no mental imagery, no clarity. It was just the kind of sort of association or concept, or just a random feeling of familiarity. Who knows? All right. It has been so much